boss made me work through my mother's funeral. So I sent one email that ended his career. I was standing in the hospital hallway when my mother took her last breath, and all I could think about was how disappointed she would be in what I was about to do. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly white glow. My eyes were so swollen from crying that I could barely see my phone screen, but I knew I had to make the call. My hands shook as I dialed David Hale's number. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear him talking to someone in his office. I took a breath and explained what had just happened, my voice cracking on every word. I asked for bereavement leave to plan the funeral and grieve. His response hit me like a punch to the stomach. "We're short-staffed, Claire," he said, his tone completely detached. "Family stuff will have to wait." I stood there, holding the phone to my ear, staring at my mother's lifeless body through the window of her hospital room. That's when my phone buzzed with an urgent email notification from work. Monday morning came too fast. I was wearing black, standing in the parking lot of the church where we were about to say goodbye to my mother. My laptop bag felt heavier than usual as I climbed into my car and set up for the meeting David had forced me to attend. My hands were still shaking, and I hadn't slept more than an hour since Saturday. I dialed into the video call and watched David smile at the client as if nothing was wrong. Then he made a joke that changed everything inside me. "She's multitasking, folks," he said to the room full of people, his voice dripping with mockery. Funeral or not. Laughter filled my headset. Real, genuine laughter from people who thought this was funny. I felt my tears stop immediately. Something inside me, something I didn't know existed until that moment, hardened into cold steel. I watched David on screen, smiling like he had just told the best joke in the world, and I made a silent promise to myself. I returned to work on Tuesday, my grief still raw and bleeding. The office was awkwardly quiet when I walked in. Coworkers wouldn't look me in the eye. They shifted their gaze away whenever I passed their desks. I felt like I had done something wrong by mourning my own mother. That afternoon, David sent out a company-wide email. "I want to recognize Claire's incredible commitment," he wrote, his words dripping with false sincerity. "Even during tough personal times, she shows up for the team. That's the kind of loyalty that builds companies." I read it 3 times, each word feeling like another insult. He was mocking me. He was literally mocking my grief in front of the entire company and making it sound like praise. I brought the issue to HR, explaining how his comment during the client call had humiliated me. The HR manager looked uncomfortable and said, "He's just under a lot of stress, Claire. I'm sure he didn't mean anything by it." I left her office feeling smaller than I had ever felt before. That evening, I printed the entire email chain and locked it in my desk drawer. After that, I entered a strange new phase of my life. My grief transformed into something different, something focused. I started watching David like a hawk. I noticed how he treated people differently based on their usefulness to him. I saw how he praised executives, but ignored junior staff. I observed the way he would mention certain vendors, always the same ones, always described as family-owned subcontractors. One afternoon, I noticed something odd. An invoice needed approval, and it had my digital signature on it. My heart stopped. I had never authorized that invoice. I had never even seen it before that moment. Asked around quietly, and no one seemed to know anything about it. That night, I took the invoice home and stared at it for hours, my mind racing with possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. I started staying late at the office, long after everyone else had gone home. I would sit at my desk with just the desk lamp on, comparing project ledgers and financial records. The numbers didn't add up. Payments were going to vendors that didn't seem to exist. I dug deeper into the vendor files and noticed a pattern that made my stomach turn. All these family-owned subcontractors that David constantly praised led to the same P.O. box. When I traced that box, my suspicions were confirmed. The P.O. box belonged to someone I recognized from the company Christmas party. It was David's brother-in-law, the one everyone joked about because he never seemed to do any real work. David was using company money to funnel payments to his family member. This wasn't just wrong. This was fraud. I was so focused on examining files one night that I didn't hear David approach until he was standing right next to my desk. His shadow fell across my computer screen, and I jumped so hard I nearly knocked over my coffee. He smiled down at me, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just caught his prey. "Don't go snooping, Claire," he said quietly, his voice carrying a threat beneath the polite words. "Curiosity kills careers." The way he said it, with such casual certainty, reminded me of how he had mocked my grief. It was the same tone, the same arrogance, the same complete disregard for my feelings or my value as a person. He walked away, leaving me trembling at my desk. But this time, I didn't feel afraid. I felt determined. I made a decision right then. I wouldn't confront him. Not yet. I would document everything first. I would build a case so solid that he would never be able to deny it or escape it. The next day, I bought a cheap external hard drive from an electronics store on my lunch break. I was careful not to use my work computer for anything that could be traced. Instead, I used the public Wi-Fi at a coffee shop to access the company files remotely and download everything I could find. Emails, project files, financial records, vendor information. Everything went onto that drive. As I gathered more information, the scope of the fraud became clear to me. This wasn't just about funneling money to family. David had involved state-funded contracts. He was falsifying inspection reports on projects that received government money. People's safety might depend on these inspections being honest. That realization terrified me. Then I found something that made my blood run cold. My name was on one of the falsified inspection reports. As the senior project coordinator, my signature verified the inspections. I had never signed off on those inspections. My digital signature had been forged, and now I was legally complicit in the fraud whether I wanted to be or not. Everything escalated when David announced an internal audit. He seemed panicked, though he tried to hide it. A few days later, he called me into his office and asked me to do something I couldn't refuse to do without raising suspicion. "That spreadsheet we discussed," he said carefully, "it needs to be adjusted before we submit it to the auditors." He wanted me to alter financial records. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. If I refused, he would fire me and probably blame me for everything. If I complied, I would be crossing a line I couldn't come back from. But I had learned something during all this. I could be smarter than he was. I created two versions of the spreadsheet. One was exactly what he wanted, the numbers altered to hide the fraud. The other was perfectly clean, showing exactly what had really happened. I saved both versions and kept them safe. David's behavior toward me changed after that. He became publicly hostile, blaming me for project delays that weren't my fault. He stopped including me in client meetings and demoted me from client-facing responsibilities. He was isolating me, treating me like I was the problem. I knew what he was doing. He was trying to establish a narrative where I was the troublemaker, so when he eventually fired me, it would look justified. But I didn't fight back. I stayed quiet and kept working. One afternoon, a coworker who had always been kind to me, a woman named Marcus, approached me in the break room. She slipped me a USB drive and whispered quickly, "You should see what he sends from his personal email. Be careful with this." Before I could ask her any questions, she walked away. My hands were shaking as I pocketed the drive. That night, I plugged Marcus's USB drive into my personal computer and opened the files. What I found made me feel sick. David had been bragging to his inner circle about how they were bleeding the state dry and laughing about how easy it was to get away with it. The emails were casual, cruel, and absolutely damning. He had forwarded multiple messages showing exactly how the fraud worked. I recognized one project name immediately. It was the project where my signature had been forged. The liability was real now, tangible and terrifying. I was connected to this fraud in a way that could destroy my career, my reputation, and my future. But that realization also crystallized something in my mind. I had to act. I couldn't let this continue. I couldn't protect myself by staying silent because my silence was already making me guilty. I called a lawyer friend of mine, someone I had known since college. We met at a coffee shop where I knew we wouldn't run into anyone from work. I laid out everything I had discovered, and she listened carefully, without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at me seriously and said, "If you resign now, he will bury you. He'll claim you stole from the company. He'll say you forged those signatures yourself. You have no protection if you just walk away." Her words terrified me, but then she continued. "There's a way to protect yourself," she explained. "There's an internal compliance whistleblower system designed for situations exactly like this. It creates a paper trail and documentation that protects you legally. If you report this through the right channels, you'll be protected." A week later, something unexpected happened. I was working on a client call when I heard a new voice, Marcus from Westbrook Engineering. The company had been partnering with Hale Construction for the past year. During a break in the call, Marcus reached out to me privately through the messaging system. "I've been impressed with your professionalism," the message said. "If you ever think of leaving Hale, give me a call. We'd love to have someone like you on our team." I saved that message. I didn't respond, but I kept it safe. It was like a lifeboat had suddenly appeared in the distance. I filed it away mentally, connecting it to the plan that was beginning to form in my mind. I wasn't just going to report David. I was going to do it in a way that would protect my future and secure my next step. I began a new phase of my plan. I started forwarding project updates to my personal email, disguising them as routine work summaries and progress reports. Each email built my paper trail, creating a timeline that would be impossible to dispute. I was meticulous about it, making sure everything looked completely normal. I didn't want David or anyone else to suspect that I was collecting evidence. Then, about 3 weeks into this process, I discovered that David was planning to announce a major government contract win at a board meeting. I pulled the project file, and my stomach dropped. The safety data attached to the bid was completely falsified. The inspection reports were forged. The certifications didn't exist. This was the moment. This was the fraud at its biggest, most damaging point. If that contract went through, if the government funded that project based on false safety data, someone could actually get hurt. If you're interested in stories about justice and standing up for what's right, please like and hit that subscribe button now. The board meeting was on a Thursday afternoon. I was sitting in the conference room, listening to David prepare to announce this massive contract that he knew was built on lies. The room was full of excitement and energy. I watched the board members lean forward, impressed by the numbers, excited about the company's growth. Then David did something that gave me the final push I needed. During the presentation, he paused and looked at me. "Maybe if you spent less time grieving and more time performing," he said to the room, "we'd have more wins like this." The room went silent. People looked down at their papers, clearly uncomfortable with what he had just said. I felt my coworkers' eyes on me, filled with sympathy and awkwardness. But I didn't feel anger or pain. I felt calm. I looked at David steadily and said, "Noted." My voice was completely steady. I could see the surprise on his face that I hadn't reacted the way he expected. He didn't understand that I was already past the point of being hurt by him. He was about to be destroyed by the truth, and I had already accepted that responsibility. The local news ran the story about Hale Construction's major contract when the very next day. David was quoted extensively, talking about the company's commitment to safety and excellence. His picture was in the newspaper showing him shaking hands with a government official. He looked like a winner. He looked like someone the world could trust. I sat at my desk and read the article 3 times, and each time I knew more certainly that I had to act. This contract was built on forged safety certifications. This contract was going to be funded by state money that was being stolen. This contract could get people killed if any of those falsified safety measures were relied upon. I had to report it before the fraud went any further. There was no more time to wait, no more time to prepare. I had to send the email now. David canceled my vacation request that afternoon. I had requested time off to visit my aunt, to get away from the office for a few days and try to process everything that had happened since my mother's death. "You've had enough personal time," he said coldly when I asked him about it. That was what he called my mother's funeral. Personal time. I looked at the photo of my mother that I kept on my desk, a picture of her smiling at me on my college graduation day. She had always taught me to do what was right, even when it was hard. She had raised me to be honest and strong. That evening, I opened my email and created a new message. The subject line read, "For internal investigation, contract 47B, discrepancies noted." I began to type. The email took me 3 hours to write. I attached every document I had collected, every timestamp, every piece of evidence. I included the backup of the USB drive. I included the forged inspection reports with my name on them. I included the falsified safety certifications. I included David's own emails bragging about bleeding the state dry. I CC'd every person who needed to see this: company legal, HR, the board, and the state contract officer. I wrote it in clear, professional language, laying out exactly what I had found and what it meant. My hands were shaking as I reviewed it one final time. This email was going to change everything. For David, it was going to end his career. For me, it was going to change the trajectory of my entire life. I said a silent apology to my mother for not being able to avoid this. Then I clicked send. The detonation happened within 24 hours. I came to work the next morning and immediately knew something was wrong. The office had a different energy. Legal had frozen all accounts. Emergency meetings were being called throughout the building. People were whispering in hallways. Around mid-morning, David stormed into my office, his face red with rage. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice shaking with fury. I looked up at him calmly and said, "My job." Those 3 words seemed to deflate him completely. He opened his mouth to say something else, but then security guards appeared in my doorway. One of them approached him and said they had orders to escort him from the building pending an investigation. I watched him leave, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. I didn't feel happy. I felt sad. I felt like I had just watched someone destroy his own future through his own choices. The days that followed were confusing and difficult. Rumors swirled through the office like a virus. Some co-workers avoided me, clearly uncomfortable with what I had done. I overheard conversations where people called me a traitor, even though they didn't know the full story. Other co-workers were more supportive, thanking me quietly and telling me they had suspected something was wrong. But David wasn't just accepting his fate quietly. He was fighting back, trying to shift the blame. Word filtered back to me through Marcus that David was claiming he had acted alone, that I had misunderstood everything, that I was a disgruntled employee trying to get revenge. The lies stung, even though I knew they were lies. I received an official summons to testify before an internal investigation committee about everything I had discovered. The hearing took place in a small conference room at a law office downtown. I sat across from 3 investigators who listened as I presented my evidence. I had organized everything chronologically, showing how David had set up the fraud, how he had involved me without my consent, and how the scheme had grown larger and more dangerous over time. Every document I presented matched up perfectly with the others. The timeline was airtight. The evidence was overwhelming. When I finished, one of the investigators closed his folder carefully and looked at me with something that resembled respect in his eyes. "Ms. Jensen," he said quietly, "this is going to make headlines." I knew that he was right. I had just exposed one of the biggest fraud schemes the company had ever dealt with, and there was no way to keep it quiet. #boss made me work THR. The headlines came exactly 1 week later. CEO under investigation for fraud. Whistleblower employee cleared. The local news announced. The company's board fired David for cause. The state terminated all of Hale Construction's government contracts. An investigation was launched into years of similar fraudulent activity. My inbox began to fill up immediately with messages from reporters, lawyers, and people from other companies who said they had suspected similar frauds at their own workplaces. Most of the messages I ignored or deleted, but one name stood out among all the others. It was Marcus from Westbrook Engineering. The message was short and direct. "Congratulations on doing what was right. We're hiring. Are you interested?" I accepted the interview invitation immediately. 2 days later, I was sitting across from Marcus in a sleek office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. She told me that Westbrook Engineering had been paying close attention to how I had handled the situation at Hale. "We admire integrity," she said simply. "We want you to lead our compliance department." We need someone who understands exactly what fraud looks like and how to prevent it. Someone who is brave enough to stand up when things are wrong. I accepted the position on the spot. That afternoon, I returned to Hale Construction's office for the last time and quietly packed my things from my desk. I was trembling as I walked out the door, but they were tears of relief, not pain. I was leaving this chapter of my life behind completely. A month after starting my new job, I heard through Marcus that David had applied for a position at Cornerstone Industrial, a smaller construction firm that had struggled in recent years. That same company was also a vendor that Westbrook Engineering was considering partnering with. My department received the request to conduct a complete due diligence review of Cornerstone's operations, finances, and personnel. It was a routine request, nothing unusual about it. But when I pulled the personnel file on their new hire, I saw David's name in the application materials. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very work I was now doing, compliance and fraud prevention, meant that I was about to investigate the man who had destroyed my grief and mocked my mother. During the background check process, David's name appeared in the system with a flag. Pending fraud investigation was listed beside his record. The system automatically rejected his application before I even had to make a decision. I sat at my desk and smiled as I forwarded the notice to legal with a simple note: vendor review complete. I didn't need to do anything else. The system itself had rejected him. Justice didn't require me to lift a finger. The consequences of his own actions had caught up with him naturally, inevitably, completely. He would never work in construction again. His reputation was destroyed. His career was over. I set up my new office at Westbrook with care and intention. I placed a framed photo of my mother on my desk first thing, right where I could see it whenever I needed to remember why I had been brave enough to do what was right. Outside my window, the city stretched out in all directions, full of light and possibility. The sun reflected off the glass buildings of the downtown skyline, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. I whispered to that photo of my mother, "You taught me to stand up for what's right, Mom." I finally did. That night, an email notification popped up on my computer. I opened it to find a message from HR. Promotion approved, Director of Compliance. I had only been at Westbrook for 4 weeks. They were promoting me to the position I had always dreamed of having, the position that let me make sure fraud like David's could never happen anywhere I worked. Justice had come not as quick revenge, but as quiet, permanent triumph.